I hope that you welcome me in joining our three presenters, Carla, Sharif, and Sharon. I will let them introduce themselves. I think they'll be much more succinct and to the point that I will be. So I think we will start with Sharon. Great, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I am joining today from the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. So I am in what we call Mississauga today from a little tiny hotel room, and very, very glad to be with you today. I am the founder and CEO of a small but mighty team. We call ourselves Quake Lab, and we like to focus on structural change when it comes to the work of equity, justice, and inclusion, which means that we are particularly interested in what it looks like to investigate, to understand, and to redesign systems that are not working for the most marginalized among us. And we know that once we get to a place where this is where our focus and where our lens is at, everyone will benefit. So that's me, and I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm really happy to share some space with these wonderful people. Maybe I'll pass it over to Sharif because I can see you.
Thank you, Sharon. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharif Mahdi, and I use he, him, and il pronouns. I am privileged to serve as the CEO of the Students' Commission of Canada, and we are a national charitable organization that works with others to put young people's ideas into action. And as such, when we acknowledge our territories, we're acknowledging that our team is on territories across the country from coast to coast to coast. And we spend quite a bit of time understanding the treaties that govern our territories and also the history of the residential schools that are close to our territories so that we can walk that path of reconciliation in a good way. I'll pass it over to my co-speaker, Carla.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carla Stevenson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining today from Siniex's stolen and unceded land in what is colonially called BC. I live in the mountains in a town of 300 people, but my work is at mostly a provincial scale. I work in partnership with the BC Arts Council on a project you'll hear about in a minute. And I also am the founder of the Rural Arts Inclusion Lab, soon to be renamed the Rural Arts Impact Lab, because I have a lot of questions around the word inclusion in terms of what we're being included into. Also, I run a small rural arts organizations, and I work in systems change mostly. So my work sits at the intersection of giant systemic change, a tiny little town, and arts administration. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Really looking forward to hearing from all three of you. So Sharon, would you like to start your presentation, and then we'll go, I guess, in that order, with Sharif second and Carla third, and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Okay, just gonna take over from the person sharing the screen. My apologies. So I first just want to talk about myself. That is absolutely my favorite topic. Love to talk about myself. You made a terrible mistake giving me the power of a mic and the power of sharing my screen. But really, I just wanted to start by saying, you know, I mentioned where I am today. I live, I work, and I love and play and do all the great things in Ottawa, the traditional territory of the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin people. And in thinking about what we'll be discussing today, I think it is impossible to really talk about anything, anytime, without talking about relation to land, relationship to colonialism, and relationship to displacement, and what that looks like and how that shows up in everything we do, including the art we make. My people are traditionally from Western Kenya. I was born in Nairobi, but my people are from Western Kenya, three different communities: the Maasai, the Luhya, and the Kalenjin. And I am the first generation in my family who has been born outside of colonialism. That means I am the first generation of my family who held any kind of statehood. I am the first of my generation who can legally who was born legally being able to have a bank, who was not born a British subject, not citizen, but subject. And that means that coming into Canada is both a jarring and very familiar, was a jarring and familiar move, because I am both intimately familiar with colonialism and the ways in which it sprouts out long after the event. Colonialism is both an event and a continuous process. And once the event has completed, I am intimately familiar with that, but I'm also intimately familiar with what it means to be outside of that event and what that continuous system, how it emerges. And so coming into Canada and seeing, sort of placing myself in that first point where it has not ended and it continues to be so, was a jarring place to sit. And then to be right now where we are in a time when we are talking about decolonialism, both in really practical ways across the globe, but also in ways in which we are talking about colonialism that has happened for some places 70 years, some places over 100, and trying to understand what it means to deconstruct that regardless of time. And I don't think this is something that we can disassociate from art, or disassociate from the process of creating and curating art. And I'll start there. And throughout my slides, you'll see that there's some places where I've been very intentional about what is visually shown, and I'll mention it really briefly, but I recommend you look up all these artists. So my cover page says building an inclusive art ecosystem, Clay Collabs, Sharon Young Guesso, and on the left side I have a cut-off image a little bit, but you can see these gorgeous earrings that are absolutely some of my favorite places to shop, and that is Indie City. And then you have one of my favorite art installations that I don't know if it's still running in Ottawa, but I highly recommend you look it up. And then King Kimbit, who, if you have not heard of her, I highly recommend. Apparently, I highly recommend a lot of things. Please do jump in and listen to her music. Okay, let's get started. Art is not ahistorical, art is not apolitical, and art is not acontextual. And we see that in really obvious ways, and we see that in implicit ways throughout time, whether it is through music, through visual art, and everything in between, through earring making and whatnot. Art is not ahistorical, acontextual, or it does not exist in a vacuum. And so when we talk about art as inclusive, the necessity for art to be an inclusive ecosystem, it is one that is not a nice to have, it is not one that is an add-on, it is not a charity, it is not a moral question, but it is really a question of survival. Art and artists, since time immemorial, have been speaking to their current existence, as Miss Nina Simone so beautifully said. An artist's duty is to reflect the time. So artists have a job, whether or not they consciously or unconsciously do it, to both reflect the moment in time they exist in, but also to project, to almost look into the future of what the world can, could, shouldn't look like. So artists are both reflections of the time, and they are fortune tellers to a future that we might not want, or a future that we do want. And so artists become the central theme in our existence. Artists provide us with a reflection into our humanity. They provide us with an understanding of who we are, who we have been, who we want to be, and where we are going. They are a central theme in society. There's a reason why in trying to understand communities that exist now, communities that came before us, a central part of what we do is we study what they create, whether that's pottery, whether that's art. And art has never required curation, or more specifically, art has never required an institution of creation. Creation comes before curation. And so when we talk about why should the art ecosystem become more inclusive, and I'll even add there equitable, or align itself with justice, this is not so much a question of why should we do this for artists. Artists will exist with or without art institutions. They will exist with or without curation. Artists are necessary to our survival. They're necessary to our humanity. Curators and the organizations that surround the art ecosystem, we love you, but you are actually not. And so the question of inclusive ecosystems is one of survival. And so when we talk about what does it mean to create an inclusive ecosystem, or why should we create it, I invite us to almost rethink that question and really focus on the question. Excuse me, my apologies, I'm getting a little sick. And really refocus our attention into what role do we play in ensuring that artists can thrive. Because although I say that artists are the central piece here, and art organizations are sort of the ecosystem that surrounds them, that both feeds from them, but also feeds into them, and are valuable, but not quite a necessity for the creation of art. Art organizations have become central in placemaking within the art world, in deciding who wins, who does not win, in deciding who is valuable and who is not, in deciding what is art and what is not. So although they are not a necessity in the process of creation, they become this both pallbearer and also gatekeeper. And so when we talk about the inclusive ecosystems of art, what we are talking about is a sort of unnatural piece of an ecosystem yielding an unnatural amount of power within that ecosystem. And that is where you must situate yourself. You are not necessary, but you hold a lot of power. So then how do you ensure that that power is wielded in a way that does not create harm? Because at this stage, it's really important to note that we are not existing outside of a vacuum. So we are not starting at a blank slate and saying, how do we become inclusive? In fact, we are now talking about justice, because it has been exclusive, because it has been inequitable, it has been unjust. And so now we are course correcting to the position of justice, which means that we are not starting at a blank slate. And for that, because if you all know me, you know I'm nothing if not, I love tangible and practical. And I'm hoping I'm not taking up too much time here, so I'll wrap up here. What does that look like? So first and foremost is identifying the barriers that have intentionally or unintentionally been created that keep marginalized artists from thriving. Note here, it is not that keep marginalized artists from being artists or creating, because that is inherent. As I said, creation comes before curation and always will. And so the question is, what barriers exist both within your smaller organizations and within the larger ecosystems that either stop or make small the possibility for artists to thrive? And here it becomes really necessary to look at systems and the life cycle of what it looks like for a person to be engaged with your specific ecosystem and how they move through that system. We are talking about from the moment they walk in to the moment they walk out. What barriers to participation and access exist? And here we're talking about really practical, maybe even like unsexy stuff. We're talking about forms, we're talking about time, we're talking about resources, we're talking about language, we're talking about so much here. And it's that systematic review of what barriers exist. And then we talk about data. And here I want to be very careful, because my field is very good at asking people to collect data, but that does not come without its own terms and conditions. Data must always be ethically collected and must always be ethically kept, and it must always be ethically analyzed. Data on its own are numbers. Data has been used for nefarious reasons for many communities. And so that means data collection is not a given. Some communities, some people will often refuse to give you their data, and they're within their rights, especially if they have a history of data being weaponized against them. And so data comes hand in hand with relationship building. And maybe that's not something that folks like myself who talk about data enough don't push forward as consistently, as data and relationship are hand in hand. And the important thing with relationship building is you have to actually be doing relationship building. Oftentimes, communities, someone will say, I don't want to offer, I'm not asking for anything. I'm not asking for money. I just want to come into your community and learn your needs, whatever. I'm doing community consultation. And the thing is, that is actually asking for something. You are asking for something. Monies is not the only thing there is to be given. You are asking for time. You are asking for knowledge. You are asking for history. And for some communities, you are asking for their personhood when you ask for their data. Different communities have very different relationships with data. And so in building a relationship, you need to understand that your time, your schedule is not the end all be all, and should not be the thing that is central to the process. However, in going back to the value of data, this is what I'm asking here is for you to focus on understanding who is an artist in your space, who is getting prioritized, who is getting uplifted, and who is getting paid. That is sort of the beginning of what it means to collect that data. And some of it you already have. It's just a matter of analyzing it, because a lot of us are very good at collecting data and not very good at analyzing it. Lastly, and unsurprisingly, I think something that we all saw coming is redefining your role. If an artist's duty is to reflect the times and envision the future, what is yours and how do you get there? So once again, you are an unnecessary entity, and I mean that with so much love, but as arts organizations, you are an unnecessary entity with an unusual amount of power. What is your role here? And I would even go so far as answering to some extent that your role is to make sure artists thrive and to course correct injustices in the art world. I won't go into detail about what that looks like, because I'm sure we all know what those injustices have looked like. I mean, just the images on the left, as a good example, is a Canadian artist from Nova Scotia, Black Canadian painter, I think from the 1800s, who won one of the most prestigious American art awards. And when he came to collect his award and they realized he was Black, they tried to take that away from him. And he did get the award because his fellow artists and recipients basically mutinied. And I love that, because it becomes I think it ties really well in asking yourself, what is your role here? And then with me very unceremoniously answering for you, your role is to ensure that artists are thriving and ensure that you are course correcting the injustices that your field has perpetuated throughout time. That is all for me.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Sharon, for kicking us off and for grounding us in such a good way for the presentation today. So hello, everyone. I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Sharif Mahdi, and I use he, him, and ill pronouns, and I'm privileged to serve as the CEO of the Students' Commission of Canada. And we're a national charity that purposely works with others to ensure that young people's voices are heard and valued. We also lead a network called the Center of Excellence for Youth Engagement. And so you may be wondering, why are we here? We're not necessarily directly connected to the arts world, but I think when we were when we received some outreach about presenting, we wanted to share a little bit about our process of centering youth in decision making, because it's an approach that we've now validated as an anti-oppressive approach that works for all people when centering young people in the process of decision making versus how we do in this society. We tend to focus on making decisions for them. And if I'm building a little bit off of your presentation, Sharon, I think what you're also saying is the importance of centering the artist in the work. So I'd like to share a process that we use called the 4 pillars, which helps us to center and transfer power away from power holders to those who don't tend to have power in our society. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to lean on my good friends at the Arts Network and all of you here to let me know if our wonderful technology is in fact working. Do we have a win for the morning or afternoon? Can you see my screen? Awesome. Oh, good. That's good. So our 4 pillars at the Students' Commission of Canada are respect, listen, understand, and communicate. And we start with respect for the gift and strength that each person carries within. And particularly for young people, their idealism, and their capacity to improve the world. We're also looking at respect from the purpose of respecting folks for all of the diverse identities and intersections that they may represent, some of which may be visible and some of which may be invisible. When we respect, we can listen. We listen not only with our ears, but with our hearts and all of our senses. And we're particularly focused at listening actively and intensely, and not just for words, but also for silences, for deeds, for all ways in which young people are trying to kind of share their voice. And that might occur through speaking, through interpersonal communication, through nonverbal communication, and through visual, through art, through all sorts of ways that young people are trying to be heard. When we listen, we can understand, and that's when we put aside our own beliefs and ideas, and we put ourselves in the shoes of others. We go beyond just listening. We process what we've heard, and we reflect upon the new knowledge and gifts given to us. And what we do in particular with our third pillar of understand is we work towards having disagreements, having conflict about what our ideas might be, unlearning, relearning different concepts that maybe we grew up with, or maybe that we understood from different perspectives, and making sure that we disagree without being disagreeable. With these first three pillars in place, we start to see the action come together. That is when we work with and across generations to communicate the change that we want to see in the world. And this process of the four pillars is a systems change approach. We have used this process as an organization to tackle both large and small and big and all sorts of ideas that young people are bringing forward. So as a national charitable organization, we're focused on communicating change on all sorts of levels, for systems, for young people, on the individual level, and for the groups that they interact with. And so our programs and projects we have programs and projects that are focused on using art to build anti-racist practice. We have a project that's focused on using virtual reality to make sure that people understand the environment and climate crisis. So young people filming their environment and then sharing that in a VR kind of context with folks in other environments. For example, some of the youth we work with have filmed what's going on for them in Iqaluit or in other parts of the country, and then sharing it with Southern youth as a way to build awareness and understanding and get at that third pillar. We have a project where young people have gone through this process with us, and they are communicating the change they want to see around mental health. And we're moving away from let's talk to walk the talk, and let's actually practice what meaningful mental health supports look like. We have a project focused on gender-based violence and teen dating violence that is focused on understanding and respecting very different beliefs about what a healthy relationship should look like, so that we can communicate what healthy relationships should look for ourselves, for others, and for society as a whole. So this process of the four pillars is one that can be applied. The reason that I'm bringing it forward to this context is that this process of the four pillars is one that can be applied to any topic or any way in which you're trying to communicate the change that you're wanting to see in the world. I want to focus on a particular, just building off of your work, Sharon, which is awesome, by the way. I need to follow you or connect with you after if possible. We hear a lot in Western-based societies about the need to earn respect. You know, we earn respect, and in our context, we talk about respect as something that is immediately granted to people. That it's not necessarily about earning it. What we talk about earning, though, is trust. Trust and respect sometimes get conflated. And so when we grant respect, we are granting respect to a person and seeing them for their whole self. rather than you have to prove yourself to me before I can give you my respect. And that is an important distinction that young people have told us has made a big difference in terms of them feeling included. And we talk about the fact that we're a center of excellence for youth engagement, but really it's a center of excellence for engagement. These are approaches that work across generations, granting respect to our colleagues, to our peers, rather than going through a process of earning respect can lead to much more positive outcomes. But I want to make sure, especially when thinking about centering equity, that we don't conflate respect and trust. We can grant respect and we can build and earn trust. And this process of the 4 pillars allows us to get to a place of trust with the young people we work with at the SCC, with the community partners that are part of our work, and with society as a whole. So please just keep that in mind when you're thinking about how to kind of execute this process. For us, the communication piece tends to be the hardest part. Okay, we've respected, we've listened, we've heard what you've had to say. Now, how are we going to communicate the change that we want to see? And this is where I think the young people have pushed us to go beyond just trying to put forward strategies and reports. They're actually looking for us to communicate products and arts and ideas in multiple media and multiple methods. So one of the things that has happened really well for us in this intergenerational partnership that we do is that we are diversifying the way in which we're communicating the change we want to see in the world. So that's been really, really important for us as well, that the diversity of media or methods with which we communicate is also a very, very important consideration in the work that we do. Another point that I want to make sure is clear, which I want to connect to the work that you're doing, is the importance of intergenerational work. We hear so much about youth-led, adult-led, and we've done actually quite a bit of research on the importance of intergenerational work, which is a concept that seems a bit foreign to Western-based ways of thinking, but is actually very strongly rooted in Indigenous cultures and in cultures that are not Western-rooted. The idea of working with each other, working with generations versus working in siloed generations. So we advocate very strongly for youth-adult partnerships. And so when you're thinking about creating the structure that you're hoping to create to support a thriving artist community, we would strongly encourage you to think about these 4 pillars in the context of intergenerational relationships and partnerships. How are young people and adults working together to build this cohesive community? Because there is so much innovation and new ways of thinking that can come from young people, but there's also really great wisdom and experience that comes from adults who've been through it. And for me, I've been in this sector now for 20 years, and it's helped to keep me grounded, and it's helped to make me feel young as I've gotten older as well. So there's also those individual benefits that come from working across generations. And I'll just put a particular asterisk on what this means. In Canada, we have signed and affirmed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a very powerful document that grants rights to young people between the ages of 0 to 17. And so we would encourage you to think about working with young people under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, under that framework, who are between the ages of 0 to 17. There are some people in my network who think young people mean 12 to 35. I think that's very generous. When I'm talking about young people, I'm talking about 10 to 17, even younger. So thinking about how you can make inclusive spaces for those young voices to come in, for future and current artists to come into the mix, is a critical part of network building, because that sustainability does not happen without that legacy being passed to a new generation. I want to close on another bit of a groundbreaking topic from one of the researchers that we have been working with as well, called youth generativity. So Dr. Heather Lawford, who is the Canada Research Chair of Youth Development at Bishop's University, is a core partner of ours. And she has been talking about how important it is for all people to feel as if they're leaving a legacy for future generations and a better world for future generations. And sometimes that manifests in very positive ways, and sometimes that can manifest in negative ways. What our perception is of a better world may be very different depending on what our belief system is and how we have learned what we want to see in the world. And so I would also encourage folks, when you're thinking about the building of, centering equity and creating more opportunities for folks to be part of things, you're thinking about how you're intentionally connecting folks to a bigger purpose, to a higher purpose, a bigger purpose. What is that larger kind of beacon that is uniting and bringing people together for that common change? And for us, young people have told us that the 4 pillars have provided them with a grounding with which to kind of interact and engage and make the change happen in the world. And so making sure you're tying everything you do to that big picture. And my team gets super annoyed when I'm constantly saying, what's the reason for this? What's the purpose? That purpose, which you see right above the 4 pillars on this slide here, this page here, that is something that helps to unify and bring people and keep them focused on that legacy and that collective contribution that they're going to be making to improve and make a better world. And sometimes the problems of the world can feel so huge and so big, but if we focus in our small part of it to make it just a little bit better, that can go a long way to managing through and dealing with all of the anxieties of being in such a, I was told not to swear maybe, but in such an effed up world, right? So that is also part of what gives us lots of hope and gives us lots of energy. I'm just noticing my time, so I'm going to make sure that I don't go over, and I'll pass it over to Carla, and looking forward to questions and discussions as we continue the conversation. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you. And you can swear, you just can't swear at people.
Right. So I'll swear at the world.
Hi, everybody. Sharif, can you stop screen sharing for a sec? That'd be awesome. Awesome.
Sorry about that.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to just say thank you to these co-presenters. So many rich ideas to think about. And I want to thank Anna Lee for the insight to have folks who are cross-sectoral in their work, because often in the arts, we are so siloed and just looking at arts perspectives and not opening up our worlds and thinking to other sectors. And I also want to just thank you for allowing me to present from British Columbia, because I think it's interesting to look. Often again, we are stuck in our own context, and I think that looking at what's happening in other provinces, some provinces are way ahead in some things, and some are sadly lagging behind. And so as we all work together, it's really interesting to benchmark where our work sits according to other folks and things. So I'm just going to get right into this presentation because I have a lot to say, and we'll see how this all plays out. All right. So I want to kind of give perspective to bring this back into the arts. And so the arts and all of everything that we live in this country is in a colonial structure. And that colonial structure is big and white and strong, like these pillars. And what is challenging about that is trying to exist within this structure. So the way that I see art and artists and the work of what we do is, if these colonial structures are a house, the artists and arts people who are working in it are the folks who are coming in and out of this house. These are the folks who are celebrating. These are the folks who celebrate birthdays, have breakfast together, do all these things. And in these things, we're building relationships with inside this house. And so the beauty of that is that as our relationships build and they get stronger, they're creating roots and they're creating mycelium that are building up inside this colonial structure that we're seeing. So as things shift and change, and as we have, calls for equity and that work of moving around and things, these structures and these pillars are shaking. And as they shake, the stronger our relationships are with inside this house. We have a beautiful network that is built on trust and built on other voices that are inside this house. So that's kind of how I contextualize the work that many artists are doing within this. So I want to look at this. This is a panarchy loop, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a systems change model. And I want to just bring this kind of model into what we're talking about today, and to kind of ground it in Canadian arts. So just bear with me for a second. So the premise of a panarchy loop is looking at how things are always in change. You know, Octavia Butler says, change is inevitable. We're all change. I have this quote at the end. I don't have it off the tip of my tongue, but I really feel like we are living in this space of change. And so in the 1960s and 70s in Canada, it was a time where we started at this part of the panarchy loop, and it's called exploitation, but really it's about when there was a lot of diverse ideas that were coming up. And so in the Canadian art context, there was, this was when the National Film Board started, and this was when all of the Arts Council infrastructure came into Canada. And there were actually lots of amazing, innovative ideas that were happening at that time. But over time, as funding and granting systems got into place, we got into this space where we are in this time of conservation. And in this time of conservation, there are a few giant organizations who have been funded in this, white-led structure that are very, very strong. So we're looking at like ballets and orchestras and operas and that kind of thing. And what that has done, and giant arts organizations, and what that has done has put all the funding into these giant structures that have stayed there. Not a lot of diversity, really just these giant structures. And so this pushes away the voices, and so many folks have not been included in this kind of structure. So what we saw in the pandemic was a really big shaking of this. When we had more calls, amplification of calls for equity, things started burning down. And so we're kind of getting into this space of release, of where giant organizations are kind of feeling shaky. The work that you're doing in your work, where you're trying to think about how do you regroup and how do we, merge organizations? How does this whole thing shift? We're kind of in that stage right now. We're in the stage of release. And that can be scary, but it can also be an awesome time for opportunity. And so we call this in systems change the back loop. And so we're back looping right now into different kinds of reorganization and different kinds of things being amplified. And so this is a time, and I'm really excited about the work you're doing, because it's kind of playing off of this. It's following the structure that we're seeing other places, where people who have affinity to each other are starting to come together in systems, and they're working in different ways. All right, so I just wanted to point that out as a context. So when I think about what's happened in Canadian arts, I think about the professionalization of arts, And when I think about, what Sharon had said about, you're unnecessary, I think that the professionalization of arts might be unnecessary too. And so what other models can we look at that have been working? So although my work is mostly provincial, I also have a tiny festival in a town of 300 people. And I want to talk about what that really means if we're grounding our practice into something that's real. When we think about how do we, practice being in spaces together, and real invitations for collaboration, these things take a massive amount of time and effort, and they move at the speed of trust. So for us, I live in a resource-based town that was a mining town. And for us to be working, creating safer spaces for gender equity has been a really big battle with all of the anti-trans things that are happening. This has been, it's a dangerous space to think about sometimes. And so us working with TransConnect, with our other folks that we are working with, having their voices centered and them lead the work within our organization that took years and years to build trust is how we have moved forward. And so this year, we had this incredible drag performance in this tiny little town with those folks leading the way, these pronoun buttons, like trying to expose people in these tiny rural places to ideas that they don't have access to other places. I often hear in arts organizations when I come in to do equity work that, oh yeah, we'd love to have a Black or an Indigenous artist, but there's no audience for it. And I lead a very white organization. I live in a place where it's 89% white. And our audiences are mostly white, which you can see from that right-hand picture. However, this on the left-hand side, we have Mohammed Hassani, and Mohammed Hassani is an incredible sitar player who plays with all of the folks, plays with symphonies, it plays with hip hop artists, plays with everything, so it's our responsibility to create that, to curate and to show what is possible and what spaces are possible. the caveat of this is bringing artists into small spaces like this. There is a lot around safety. There's a lot around how do we do this. Anyway, I'm just going to move beyond thinking about, though, I really think that it's important that when you are an arts organization that you move beyond thinking about the self-preservation of your organization and move into who is the community you're serving. And the importance of doing work that includes other communities is that you can re-envision your organization to include other communities. I mean, folk festivals are dying, let's face it. Folk festivals, the average age of the person who's attending is 65 plus in our country. If we do not think about how we're going to keep moving, your audiences are going to die. So this is like, if we're talking about survival, this is about moving into that space. Okay, so I wanted to just talk about some missteps that have happened. Although I absolutely agree with Sharon that we need data collection, this is what's been happening in British Columbia, and maybe it's happened there too. So this is an actual grant application that I had to fill out. So just to give you some context, I have 150 artists over 3 days and stages going 14 hours a day, 6 stages going 14 hours a day in our festival. Okay, so here's what I was asked to do. I was asked to fill out this section based on my last year's project. And it says that, please fill in this section based on the information you currently have or is publicly available. There's no need to reach out to the artist to ask them how they identify. Just, we know it's complex, just use your best estimates. So this is from a provincial organization, right? And here are some statistics. 1 artist equals 1 group. Okay, so if you are a Black woman artist, you count as 2 people. Okay, so you count as a Black person and a woman, and make sure that your total number of people does not exceed the number of artists presented. So I would really challenge somebody to do that based on, this is just a little picture of my schedule, part of our schedule. How the heck am I supposed to do this? If somebody has an intersectional identity in a band of, this is a queer Black woman who's performing, like, how does this actually work, right? So these missteps that are happening are real and they're really awkward. And so trying to steward funding organizations through this has been problematic in this space. Okay, so the reason I think that Annalie asked me to come here is that this year we started an interesting partnership, because what we realized in looking at all of BC arts organizations was that there's a lot of harm coming to folks who are coming into those organizations. So because the funders are asking folks to tick boxes, people are hiring based on box ticking without making sure that the environments that they're coming into are actually safe for people and are actual genuine places of belonging. And I personally don't know that one more equity course that doesn't have support behind it is going to do anything for a human being. So we created, I saw you laughing, Sharon. We've created this pilot project, which is a partnership between 4 organizations: Arts BC, the BC Museums Association, the Greater Vancouver Theatre Alliance, and my organization, RAIL, which is the Rural Arts Inclusion Lab. We realized that between all 4 of our organizations, we covered thousands of organizations across BC as arts service organizations. And so what we proposed to the BC Arts Council was, please let us create something over a long span of time that is based on trust and is based on support of folks in the sector who are already overworked and are at capacity, in which we can help them actually learn about equity and support them as they put it through into their organization. So in October, we launched, and we have 70 organizations that are going through the program. And what it looks like is identifying equity and learning goals for each organization. It's not a one size fits all. It is a very cumbersome, individually focused program. We get to know the organization. We have a guide that supports them throughout the whole year. And the guide kind of looks at the organization, recommends a way to go, recommends some resources, and it's all about self-reflection and how do we integrate what we've learned in our own selves into our organizations. And so this pathway kind of goes, and we check in with guides once a month. It is awesome. We have 140 participants that are all doing this. And this is a pilot project. It's also iterative, and it is also emerging. And so it is messy, but it is awesome. And we are already in 2 months. We have seen people shift in how they're looking at things and how they're doing things. And a big part of this is cohort work. And so you're in a cohort with other organizations that are around the province, and nobody does equity properly in all ways. And it's great for people to be learning from each other of what different things are working for them or not working for them. The integral part of this is reflection, self-reflection, organizational reflection, and really thinking about how we can integrate and shift things. Because although I agree that our organizations are not necessary. We do have this infrastructure that's already here, and there are a lot of folks who are trying to come along. And wouldn't it be amazing if we could get everybody coming along? But it is going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of effort. Okay, that's all I have for now.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, just before we take some questions, I was going to ask the three of you to ask questions of each other, because I think, because you haven't actually met each other until this morning, you're all presenting very different perspectives. Just as a kind of a Kickstarter to the dialogue with who is here virtually and in person. This moderated portion might be nice just to kick off some questions and some synergies between your ideas to get people started.
Can I ask you a question, Sheree? As a beginning? All right. So I was recently in a little town called Prince Rupert, and there were Indigenous carvers there who are, people who have, survived a genocide, right? And there's a huge need for that knowledge transfer to happen between elder carvers and younger folks. And so we are, part of my work is advocacy. So advocating to the BC Arts Council that this becomes one of the pillars of what they do is this kind of intergenerational work, because we are actually going to lose folks who have already, come through so much. And so I'm wondering if you have examples of this and how that has worked, or not just this, but like intergenerational work.
Yeah. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to try, because I could really dominate the rest of this entire conversation with all the examples. There is a website resource that maybe you've used to everyone here called Youth Who Thrive, which documents all of the different best practices in 10 different ways and was done intergenerationally. It's called youthwhothrive.ca, and it lays out all of the different features or characteristics of what a successful youth program experience looks like, which includes the intergenerational component. The way in which we've approached intergenerational relationships, regardless of what the topic is to think of it from a youth program design perspective, which is why I would suggest Youth Who Thrive, to think about the key features that you need in order to achieve the change that you're looking to see. And one of the key features of a successful youth program is the integration of family, school, and community efforts. When youth work is integrated in with the school, with family, with community partners, which includes intergenerational components, and not just necessarily parents and guardians as that intergenerational, because young people do much better if they have, we have research that shows that a young person does better in their life if they have at least one consistent caring adult in their life who isn't a young person or who isn't their parent or guardian. That integration of efforts goes a really long way to resulting in positive change. But one of the number one ways that we do this is we actually try to convene, because this northern half of Turtle Island is so broad and so diverse, we try to create convenings of young people from all sorts of communities with intergenerational partners. We have funding to support national youth conferences, and we'd love to maybe bring some of these elders and youth to this space where they can work actually across generations and across regions to communicate and think through the change they're looking to see. And then we try to leverage our national network to make that case for you. We just supported the city of Vancouver in particular in taking a more upstream prevention approach to youth violence prevention. So with this youth adult partnership at the center of it. So just a few, I'm trying not to go good. I timed myself for 2 minutes and I made it, but I just wanted to give you both the theory and the practice in my response. Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Sharon. I just wanted to know if you could just what do you, I kind of got really excited by the anti-training lady that, that you referred yourself to. So I'm just curious about, like how the knowledge transfer occurs outside of the maybe westernized. Oh, let's just do a workshop for that. Let's just do a workshop to solve that problem. Like, how are you seeing the knowledge transfer that results in systems change happen? In a way that is maybe less of the like, we did the DEI workshop, we're done, kind of approach. Yeah.
Thank you. So that's, to be clear, this is specifically within like a more traditional DEI practice where the framework that was put forward was this idea of like, I am going to come into a room, and I'm going to tell you either as much as humanly possible about like oppression in the world, or I will tell you like this 101 concise in an hour and a half kind of situation. It's really funny because my partner just did one of those yesterday, and I grilled him during dinner to be like, tell me exactly what happened. What, because I just want to understand like what it actually, it's looking like at this moment in time. And I think the challenge with it was, okay, so I'm going to try what you just did, which does not take up 3,300 hours. So the challenge is first the inception. So these trainings were initially designed, or like this type of DEI practice was designed in response to having a more diverse workforce with legislation. So specifically in the United States, we had civil rights legislation that emerged that meant that women, people of color were, and even actually queer people to some extent, were in the workplace more visibly and not as like support staff, like, the help. And so organizations, this is around the 70s and the 80s, started then becoming really concerned about the risk associated with having a more diverse workplace and what that could look like alongside civil rights legislation. And so they started doing these trainings, not to make the workplace better for these incoming staff, but to mitigate risk. So that, Bill down at finance isn't doing a racism, right? That was the whole idea, to teach him not to do a racism, at least not out loud, because it was a legislative risk. And so when you have this place that it's beginning, and then that continues over time, and some nuance was added over time, when we started talking about things like inclusivity, when we started talking about things like the benefit of diversity. But then at the end of the day, the reason I start there is we have to think about what is the purpose. And today, what is the purpose? And it's often positioned as an important aspect of learning. But if you lean into what we know and the knowledge and research we have around the environment in which people learn, and more specifically, environment in which behavior change happens, it is not in an hour and a half or even 3 hours, one time, once a year in your workplace. That is not the environment in which knowledge transfer and also behavior change happens. So why are we relegating it to these like spaces? And so there's a time and a place for some structured knowledge transfer, I think. So like, for instance, my team and I, we do this session called Equity as a Technical Skill, and it's not meant for us to be, we're not trying to teach, we're not trying to give you knowledge. What we're trying to do is take what you already know and provide a framework that you can build with, you can continue to build out with. And where does knowledge transfer happens? I think, again, that goes back to our, like, what we know about learning. So I always say, sort of as a joke, but not really, that the letters DEI is like saying, going into a florist and saying wedding. Like everything changes, right? Like, suddenly you're dealing with a whole, like, everyone's like, okay, oh my gosh, okay. So like when we talk about like learning and equity, the second you bring that into a space, it's almost like we forget what we know about how knowledge transfer works. And that is usually, knowledge transfer requires trust, it requires time, it requires context, and it requires the right environment, right? So for instance, I mean, maybe I don't know if I'll be made a liar, but Arts Network is in the room, so they can let me know if this is true. Where we find, I first of all, I never claim to do knowledge building. That is not something I claim to do. Any knowledge building that happens is, I think, happenstance. Because if you are working with someone for 6 months to a year, and you are talking often, and you are explaining why you're doing what you're doing, and you are giving context to the decisions that you're making, and you're providing the resources that you yourself are using, knowledge transfer happens there in that space, in the doing. And that does require someone who is part of the doing, knows what they're doing for sure. But there's, and it's really interesting because I think this ties really nicely to that question of like intergenerational change and systems change in like how these things actually happen. And that's what I mean when you say DEI, like saying wedding in a florist, like we sort of like release ourselves from reality a little bit. And I want us to bring us back to reality based on what we already know.
Okay, I just wanted to think about before this Pathways project with the Rural Arts Inclusion Lab, we had 350 organizations going through online DEI training in 2020 to 2023, let's just say. And so, but the biggest change that happened, and I really feel like power is a piece, that's why I really liked what you said, Sharon, about power, because the biggest change that happened in all of those organizations and all of those folks was one human who was on the BC Arts Council at the time, had that shift happen inside her, where you actually saw like that actual in a space with other folks, saw that shift happen, and her leveraging her privilege in that room after that shift was actually the only thing that I think, not the only thing, sorry, there were lots of other, the biggest thing that had an effect in the entire system. Like if I was mapping out where the systems change happened, that is what happened, is that one human who could be held in a really beautiful and trusting way, that shift was actually what shifted things. So I just think overlapping where people's power and privilege is and activating those folks to activate that power and privilege after they've had a really meaningful and deep internal transformation. There you go. Okay.
Yeah. If I can, sorry, I'm going to do the thing. If I can jump in here. And I think that this might line up with what both of you talked about or alluded to, that I don't know if this is intentional for both of you, but I do want to be mindful that none of us said what needs to happen is you need to focus all your attention and all your resources on diversifying your team. Like, thank you. Okay. I think that was intentional across the board because that's a really important area of work that needs so much more time into it. There's this idea that like the mere presence of marginalized people is in and of itself equity work. And I think that becomes really important because, as Carla, you had said, a lot of harm happens when you're bringing people in, but you're not prepared for them, or you are in a space that is actively going to be dangerous for them. And there's also the fact that this is a thing maybe that might feel uncomfortable to talk about often, but like, your identity doesn't make you, it doesn't give you the expertise you need to do this. Like I didn't come out of the womb and be like, oh, my Black womanhood just made me ready to do this job. Like, this took a lot of time and knowledge building and like effort and learning, right? And so the idea that like my mere presence is what makes me equipped to do this is both quite dangerous for the work itself, and also it is quite dangerous for me as an individual, because that means that I'm going to then start creating methodology or leaning on methodology that either doesn't exist or isn't tried and tested and proven. And there's also the fact that, like, again, this is one of those uncomfortable pieces. There's this thing Black people like to say, like, I'm trying to skin folk aren't always kinfolk, right? There's the fact that we all exist within white supremacy, capitalism, all of the isms, right? And that means we are not immune from it just because of our identities. There are people who look like us, who come from the same places as us, who can also cause violence and who can also make bad decisions for the rest of us. And so that idea of leaning fully into identity or representation isn't one that should be thought about in a silo or a vacuum. Now, this is not me saying do not try and investigate. If what I think about it as is, if you look at your institutions and say, hey, there's very few of X, that is not an invitation to say, let's pile you in here. It's an invitation to assess why. What are the barriers that make it so difficult? Or even more so, if there is only one or two, what superpowers did you have to be developed to get in through here? Because you obviously did. Okay, there's a lot of answers, so I'll stop there.
I'm really grateful that you actually said something that that really the discomfort. I'm going to say something really uncomfortable because what I've been noticing in consultants that I've been working with in the province, especially white women consultants, we call them the owls, the old white ladies. As an acronym. But anyway, I've been noticing that there's a narrative that's evolving, and the narrative is in arts organizations that we've hired all these diverse people and they don't have the professionalism we're used to, and we don't have the professionalism in this thing. So they've advertised that, hey, we're open to new diverse ideas and we're open to new ways of doing things, and then they've welcomed folks into their thing, and then they are back to business as usual, and what they're saying is that narrative, and I think it's really dangerous. And so I just wanted to call that out as something that's happening, at least over here in BC.
I'll just quickly go. This is such okay. Like, we better be careful not to take up the whole time on this, but
Yeah.
super excited about this conversation, and I just want to pop an article into the chat that has proved super like helpful for us as an organization focused on systems change. Maurice Mitchell's Building Resilient Organizations has been like groundbreaking for us, and particularly how the almost weaponization of identity is actually perpetuating capitalism and neoliberal structures, which was really kind of, and I'm very careful to use the term weaponization of identity, but it was just a very powerful, it let my team breathe when we were going through so much churn, because it was like, wait a second, like, I think sometimes we tend to eat our own as well in our own systems and our own networks and make pure perfection the enemy of the good. And this article really helped to kind of name what we wanted to do as an organization to be much stronger and much better. I think, Annalie, I posted this article, and that's when you thought I should join this meeting. And like, that's when you reached out to me. And I didn't even talk about this article today, but this article is really helpful. And just a key lesson from it is just, we talk a lot about the difference between representation and reflection. And there's a DEI, like in the anti-training training on Sharon's point, there's a DEI approach, which is like, check. I've got a queer person, I've got a Black person, check. And for us, the conversation has shifted away from that to more, how is our organization reflecting the communities we serve? And that reflection doesn't necessarily have to be a paid staff position. You know, we have a lot of conversations with our Indigenous partners, how it's actually more appropriate for us to take a organization to organization approach in a lot of the work that we do, versus like, check, we have an Indigenous staff, check, we have an Indigenous board member, like that, you know, that's an example, a concrete example of how that like relationship-based approach has gone a very long way to us moving away from reflection. And it just so happens, when we did a bit of a survey of the team and what was going on, without any kind of like attempt to check, we have like at least 10 elements of diversity within our team, because the 4 pillars, that granting of respect, has, in a proactive way, without us feeling the need to check, has resulted in a culture of inclusion. And I'm not saying we're perfect. We've had folks leave and not be happy. Like, I'm not pretending that it's been perfect, but if you wanted to do the checklist, we do have every element of diversity without doing the checklist. Do you know what I mean? Because we have created the conditions for that diversity to be respected and thriving, and for difference to be supported and strengthened, and there's a space for it. So I think that's also an important approach, is that people go to the checklists or go to the trainings to build, exactly, creating spaces of belonging. Yeah, and my only other point would just be, there are other elements of diversity than the ones that we see. And I think those are often like lost in the conversation. You know, there's people's exploring their, you know, I'll just share my own, like, I'm queer, I'm Muslim, and I'm biracial, like, you know, so there's also, you're not just one element of diversity, and there's intersections that play that also need to be centered in how we think about belonging. Thanks, Carla, for putting that in there. And now I think we should pass it over to Annalie to actually get us under control here and moderate the conversation.
Thank you so much. It's such a rich conversation, and I'd like to give people the opportunity to ask questions from the floor and from their virtual spaces.
Oh, yes.
I've
Jen.
heard that some people aren't crazy about the term diversity now. The phrase I've heard is it centers whiteness. I'm kind of wondering how widespread that kind of feeling about things is.
Can you hear?
Great, did that pick up on so the
think-
question was around using the term
Diversity.
term
as a
diversity-
center whiteness.
and how that centered whiteness.
Do you mind if I jump in first? Okay. So I'm mostly speaking first because I know I might not be the resounding voice here, but I don't okay, let me start by this saying language is important. We can agree on that. But I don't spend a lot of time on semantics. Because I think this is now I'm using the word liberal very liberally, but I think within like liberal spaces, we are not very strategic. Like when you look at, I often say we have a lot to learn from some of the most hateful people in society. They're very strategic, they're very focused, and they are very action driven. We, and again, using the word liberal very liberally, liberals spend a lot of time eating each other up about semantics, about, you know, well, you said this and this is not, and language is important. That is not to undermine that, but yes, diversity probably does center white, because there is, you know, when people say like we're looking for diverse, I'm like, okay, so you're saying like everyone who's not, and then you start listing out things. So absolutely, we can go through that. But at the end of the day, we don't claim, and I don't think any of us can say our job is to be linguists. I think our job is to respond to the most urgent and also the not urgent of our needs that have not been met for a very long time. So absolutely, there's probably an argument to be made there, but like, I'm probably not going to spend a lot of time on it.
Great, thank you. So CJ, and I'll just read out a comment from the chat from CJ, and then we'll take your question, Katie, just so that everyone in the room can't see the chat. The mention of cross-sectoral work and the owl metaphor remind me of what has happened in academic conversations where speakers and profs about the value of collaboration. Their response has been, well, if I work with partners outside my discipline, I lose or threaten my chance of publication. You know, I think we feel that sometimes too in the work that we do, that any kind of threat to our stability or working outside kind of, you know, any destabilization causes anxiety. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So Katie, go ahead with your question. And then Sharif, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to CJ's thing, but I'll wait for Katie's question.
Oh, it's okay. You can go ahead. I might go on a different tangent, so go ahead.
Oh, is it okay? Just really quickly, as you're building, I've been in so many conversations where organizations are building a blank, something blank that's going to shift how your community or what your approach is to things. And Annalie, you might remember this from the 5 or 6 years ago that you helped us launch a strategy that has been very transformative for my own organization. If you didn't know, Annalie was a consultant for us in helping shape a 10-year strategy for us. We embrace the principles of network leadership, which have 4 principles. They were called network entrepreneurship, but we changed the word to leadership because we wanted to think about ourselves as how to be an organization. One of our key priorities emerging from the Annalie work that we did was to strengthen the network of youth thriving organizations across the country rather than grow ourselves and be bigger. And there's 4 key principles to CJ's point that I want to share that were at first tricky, but now are commonplace. So the first is mission, not organization, which is really focused on like the broader social change you're trying to see. And it doesn't necessarily matter who takes credit for that. The second is trust, not control. How are we making sure that when we invest in long-term relationships versus trying to micromanage and control relationships that exist within our, within our networks, our society. The other one is node, not hub, which is instead of being an organization that hoards knowledge, hoards creativity, hoards innovation, we are constantly something that is pushing out and catalyzing knowledge to be shared with our network. And then the final one is humility, not brand, which is instead of focusing on like the packaging and the portraying of it, let the work speak for itself and let the brand be built based on the work that you're doing. Now, the young people we work with changed this one from humility. So walking the talk in terms of intergenerational partnership, they changed it from humility, not brand, to brand, not brag, which was which is that we do want the work to be so powerful that that is the brand, but we don't need to brag about it. Let the work speak for itself. So those 4 key principles have been transformative for our organization. Our revenue streams have gone up. Without us, our network, our reach, all of those pieces have improved without us investing in the flashy or the competitive or the non-collaborative way. Is it easy? Hell no. It's now, it was a 10-year strategy for a reason. So we're in year 6. We had a whole pandemic in the middle of it, which added a whole flavor. But that longer term visioning, that longer term thinking, and that investment in thinking about a stronger, more integrated network can pay off if you can let go of your own ego and your organization's ego. And that is super hard. I talk about it in a 5-minute soundbite like it's easy, but it is something that I have proof. The proof is in the pudding. You just need to look at our financial statements, like if you want a dollar amount, there's a dollar amount, but there's also our scale has gone from 30,000 youth to 500,000 youth. Like that is an example of that practice happening in a really good way. And also the investment in long-term thinking, like 10-year thinking is the way to go. Sorry, Carla. I think either you're going to agree with me or disagree.
I am going to agree, but I also want to just say that in BC, we've had to deal with massive forest fires, and cross-sectoral collaboration was necessary to get through it, and the arts as leadership through that. I'm working with an organization right now called Creative Recovery Network in Australia, who is 10 years ahead of us in creativity, leading the way in collaboration through disaster and recovery. And so I feel like if we don't start doing these collaborations, the world and the conditions of the world are going to force us to do it. So having these relationships underneath that you're talking about is really important prior to those things happening. That's all. Okay, bye.
Edie, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for these amazing presentations. There's so much food for thought here. I just wanted to, I don't know how to ask this in a way that makes sense because we're still very much in the thick of all of this. We're trying to work through it. We're trying to make sense of it. But I represent the public art program with the City of Ottawa, and we're a small but mighty team. We do a lot. We deal with professional artists in exhibition spaces. We have a collection, and we also commission artwork from professional artists internationally. And we're at a point in our life, in the program's life, we've been around since 1985. And we're now at a point where we need to really look at assessing the health and doing a pulse check of our program, basically, in terms of EDI and in terms of where do the gaps exist. So I've started to initiated this work because I just took on a leadership role in the program for just over a year now. And this was a commitment that I wanted to bring to the program because I've been working in it and I've been witnessing and experiencing the gaps that we have. But we keep facing barriers, internal barriers and barriers within the work that we do because there's a lack of support corporate wide for this type of work, first of all, which is a huge barrier. And also there's a lack of resources to be able to do this type of work. So what a sort of semi description of the situation is that, we have been practicing targeted equity and diversity and inclusion opportunities for our community for the past going on 10, 12 years now, but we don't have that intentional data to back it up. And so this is where our current barrier is with data. And every time we try to initiate thinking about initiating how do we collect data or how do we include data, we keep getting these collisions of, well, data is so problematic and collection of data is so problematic. And we don't want to ostracize people because of certain methodologies of collecting data. And I do like what some some of the conversation has been, Sharif, you just kind of said it, that it's if you have all the elements of diversity already in your program or in your organization, do you really need to do that, you know, necessary, I don't know, do you need to do that data collection if you know you already have the pieces in place? And I think that that's a really good description for our program and what we do, because we do know where the gaps are. We know where some of those things exist, but we don't want to be exclusionary. And we really want to make sure that we have that intention behind the work that we do. So that's a lot. I appreciate that's a lot right now, but you know, there was just a little bit of touching on data collection, Carla, in your presentation, and there's so much behind that that I want to know more about. And I want to know more about the how, the mechanics of the how to do this work.
Okay. Data is a really big word. We throw around that word like a lot of different things, but data encapsulates a lot. So I don't want to have to make you go into detail now, but first of all, congratulations on your new role. But data captures a lot, and I don't know specifically the kinds of data that you're looking to collect and why, because I think when you think about data collection, as I'm sure you know, you have to think about it as a pretty comprehensive process or exercise, right? You're trying to figure out like, what is it you don't know? What do you think knowing that information will help you do? What gaps are you trying to fill? And then how are you going to analyze? And I get, like, I was joking, but I am really serious that a lot of people are very good at collecting data, not very good at analyzing and using that data, right? And there is that process of over collection. So with that knowledge and knowing that I don't actually know for sure what it is you're trying to collect and why, I think sometimes that there is that mix of data collection that is sometimes also like community consultation, like this conflation. And there is a thing that we know of as like over consultation. There are people who have told us over and over and over and over again what they need, what is not going well, what isn't, but we just keep collecting from them. And so I think a really good place to start when it comes to a consultation, I genuinely think that when you are going through a process of like collecting information that includes like consultation, like hard data collection work, you should take more time pre-planning than that should take the biggest amount of time. Because first you want to actually kind of get a sense of like, what do we already know? And it kind of sounds like you already know a few things. What do we already know? Do we need to keep extracting from communities that are so accustomed to having this process of extraction and seeing nothing at the end of it, so that they're basically being like, yeah, we already told you, and you're like, well, it wasn't me, well, it was someone who looked like you and had your same business card or whatever, like we've already told you. And there is really a lot of value in that, because even from an academic sense, we know that what is researched is often a political question, right? What is given money to be built for knowledge to be built around is a political question. Anecdotal information is always the starting point, and then like 30 years later someone is like, oh, there's this great research that tells us that menstrual pain is as bad as a heart attack, and it's like, yeah, okay, like we told you that about 60 years ago, right? And so like it is always valuable to start with, what do we already know anecdotally and otherwise? What questions are we trying to answer that we think this is going to uniquely allow us to answer? What information do we have so far? What can, like, and also just some risk analysis, right? Like, do you know so little, and are you so devoid of information that any move you make will be risky, will be incorrect, and so on. So again, it's a big question, and data is such a big thing. Like, are we talking demographic data? Are we talking, like, what are we talking about, right? And demographic data, you are right, is heavy, and it is, again, I love what you said, Carla, like you move as quickly as trust, or go to the speed of trust, because there is a lot of trust building when it comes to data, demographic data collection, again, because it has been weaponized. And as much as I love having that information, I know why I have it. My team and I, we spend every Thursday for an hour going through that process of like, what are we collecting and why? What new information do we have that we need to shift? What do we need to be doing that we didn't do? What do we not need to be doing? How are we like, it is a pretty intensive process and it's not a small thing, but there does need to be that question of like, what are you trying to collect and why?
I just want to highlight what Amanda shared in the chat, because I think that is, Amanda actually wrote it up in a way that would have taken me 5 minutes to say, so that's really helpful. I think that the methodology of participatory action research is the one that we use, where we break down the Western-based approach to research and we think about it not as information to be hoarded or stored in a space, but information to be designed, developed, thought through in participation with the communities that it's meant to influence. And then the action word in that is, what are we going to do with it? If there isn't some sort of clear action that comes out of the process, then it shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't be done. And there are ways to do this. Like we do PAR work with 300 youth serving organizations across the country of all, like Black-led, Indigenous-led, all sorts of identities that have tended to be exploited by research, where this approach has made filling out a survey, gathering demographics, not controversial because it's grounded from a place of granting respect and it's grounded in action and participation. People are a part of the process. So, and the number one piece of advice on collecting data is reporting back on how you used it. The community partners we work with tell us that, like, you could tell us you didn't, that like it wasn't useful. That's better than like ghosting us. Please don't ghost us. Like, just tell us that you didn't use it or that it couldn't work out, and that changes everything.
What I was just thinking about is an awesome way for communities to collect data their own selves and then sell it back to other folks, because then the power stays within the community of how it's collected, and then you can sell it to multiple folks. Anyway, that was just a little flash I had. Sorry.
That's a good point. That's a really, take back the power in that way, right? Use capitalism against itself.
Carla, you talked about having people buy their data back. And I just wanted to give a bit of a kudos to your program at Pathways about how you're managing the payment into that program, is that folks can either, if they have the resources, can pay to be part of Pathways. They pay a fee to participate. They can participate for free, or they can be paid to participate. And I think that is really, that's, really dug deeply in our mind about how we're, being in the space. And we do a lot of, talked about this yesterday, that, we do a lot of pay what you can models, or with our membership or our other program, but to think about how are we paying people to come in, especially knowing that artists are some of our most valuable in our community. I just like to have a public kudos to that.
Very
that program.
inspiring. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that the biggest part of that process is self-reflection. So when people are applying to the program, we ask them questions like, do you receive operational funding? Are you in, to give self-reflection to should you be contributing or not? So the self-reflection starts from the very beginning of the process before you've even been accepted into the program. And just to be clear, the program's free to everybody. This is like a community care model, which is bigger organizations paying for less resource organizations to be able to be paid to participate. And it has worked out even so far. Boom, as a pilot.
And I would just quickly say that, like, we're not, like, I shared that our team reflects itself, but in a year or two that might change, like, to Katie's point. So it needs to be ongoing. It needs to be ongoing reflection. It's not a checklist that just happens. Some of the elders on our elders council from Indigenous knowledge have taught us, like, the path to reconciliation is multi-generational. It's not like, check, we achieved this call to action, so now we're done. No, like, it's an ongoing process of embedding reflection on an ongoing way, which also shifts ways in which people do the work, right? Because then it's not just like, I have to do this evaluation for a fund, or I have to give this data to prove myself. It's actually about ongoing learning and reflection.
Thank you to the three of you
you.
for being here. Thank you for everyone taking the time to listen, to learn with us. This is the last of this series of sessions. We're looking to do some in French in the new year. And then, of course, this is only just like the drop in the bucket of what this whole process will be over the next, I don't know, forever.
If anything, this process has taught us that this conversation isn't just a Zoom meeting, a workshop, and I'll see you later. It's very much an ongoing process. The lights are really going on in our heads and how we can reshape a model that really authentically and meaningfully addresses
all the things that are a part of our sector. And it's enlightening, it's inspiring. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today.